To die for an idea is stupid, people say. Ideas aren't real. In 1970 Tokyo, Yukio Mishima disemboweled himself in classic samurai fashion. One of the greatest writers of the post-war era, Mishima was obsessed with beauty. He was both tormented and driven by his pursuit of physical perfection. To him, life itself was art, and a violent death its ultimate expression. Born in 1925, Mishima's early childhood was dominated by his grandmother. She took him from his parents and raised him in near isolation. She forbade him from going outside, playing sports, or hanging out with other boys. In contrast, Mishima's father, Azusa, believed in strict military discipline. On the rare occasions he saw him, Azusa did things like holding him close to a speeding train, threatening to punish him if he flinched. While his childhood was abusive and lonely, it was also his grandmother who introduced him to the world of literature and theater. Mishima was drawn to stories of handsome knights, Christian saints, and noble princes meeting glorious deaths. By the first grade, he was already writing poems and short stories. Mishima finally returned to his parents at age 12. Azusa would search his room for feminine interests and frequently tore up his manuscripts. He forbade him from writing, but Mishima continued in secret, supported by his mother. Even as he immersed himself in classical Japanese literature, Mishima found himself drawn to Western writers like Oscar Wilde. By 16, he had already written hundreds of poems in both Western and Japanese styles. Even at a young age, Mishima's fantasies were often violent. Samurai disemboweling themselves or he himself being killed. He also developed an obsession with aging after watching his grandmother slowly deteriorate. In 1945, with World War II nearing its end, Mishima received a draft notice for the Imperial Japanese Army. On the day of his physical examination, however, he had a severe cold. He allowed the examiner to believe he had tuberculosis and was declared unfit for service. It isn't clear exactly why Mishima escaped the draft. Maybe he simply got cold feet, or perhaps he feared that his weak body wasn't worthy of a heroic death. Ultimately, the regiment he would have joined was later sent to the Philippines and almost completely wiped out. So had he been drafted, he likely would have died as well. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. This deeply affected Mishima. He believed that the true Japanese spirit, the spirit of the samurai, had been abandoned in favor of American materialism. 4 days later, Mishima's friend Hasuda Zenmei shot and killed his superior officer, who had blamed Japan's defeat on the emperor. Zenmei then took his own life in the Malay Peninsula. 2 months later, Mishima's younger sister died of typhoid fever at the age of 17. The post-war literary world only deepened his inner turmoil. After Japan's defeat, the US-led Allied powers occupied the country. Media expressing Japanese nationalism was heavily censored. In response, many prominent writers became leftists, with some joining the Communist Party and writing socialist realist literature. In his letters, Mishima denounced them as opportunists. In 1949, Mishima published Confessions of a Mask, a novel about a young homosexual man forced to hide his true self behind a mask. It's often seen as a thinly disguised autobiography. The protagonist, Ko-chan, experiences his first sexual awakening through an image of Saint Sebastian bound to a tree and pierced by arrows. He spends the rest of the novel drawn to male bodies, violence, and destruction, a theme seen in many of Mishima's works. There's an underlying anger in the book toward a society that forces people to look inward to justify who they are, as this creates anxiety and frustration at knowing who and what one is. Ultimately, Ko-chan never removes his mask. His loneliness grows beyond sexuality into a sense of isolation from the world around him. The same can be said for Mishima himself. Despite a string of male and female lovers throughout the early 1950s, he later confessed to feeling lonely most of the time. During this period, he traveled across the United States and Europe. When he returned to Japan, he became obsessed with transforming himself, starting with his body. His model was ancient Greece, a place he believed valued only the mind and body. It was free from the shackles of conscience, which he considered a horrendous invention of Christianity. So in 1955, at the age of 30, Mishima threw himself into intensive physical training, transforming his skinny body into a muscular one. He grew disillusioned with writing itself, believing that language distorted reality beyond recognition. In his later essay Sun and Steel, he argues that the only solution is to step into the sun. The sun represents pure elemental truth, the body's raw presence under the indifference of nature. The sun burns away illusion, especially the literary and intellectual world he had come to resent. Though writing in post-war Japan, Mishima's thinking was deeply influenced by 19th century European philosophy. Like Nietzsche, he rejected purely intellectual life and believed in self-overcoming through will and discipline. These ideas weren't unique to Mishima. Both wartime Japanese propaganda and post-war American rhetoric about capitalism and democracy had made his generation deeply skeptical of language, so artists increasingly turned toward raw physical expression. Mishima's shift to bodybuilding and martial discipline was a desperate attempt to find meaning in a modern world he saw as weak and spiritually empty. He believed the body was the only honest thing left, and to forge it like steel was to make one's life and death real. From this, Mishima concluded that mind and body should be united, and that an early death at the peak of both mental and physical strength was ideal. In this way, violence and beauty go hand in hand. Mishima explores this idea most fully in The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. The protagonist, Mizoguchi, becomes obsessed with the temple, calling it the ultimate symbol of aesthetic perfection. He's so tormented by its beauty that he eventually burns it down, seeing it as an act of liberation. If beauty is fleeting, death becomes a way of immortalizing this perfection. Dying beautifully is a recurring idea in Mishima's work. In his essay Beautiful Death, he states that once one has resolved to become a martial artist, cowardly behavior is no longer tolerated. The only options are to fight to the death or to take one's own life. In his later years, Mishima became increasingly nationalist. In Voices of the Fallen Heroes, he attacked Emperor Hirohito for giving up his divine status after World War II. Mishima argued that kamikaze pilots and pro-imperial officers had died for a living god, so Hirohito's demotion to a figurehead made their deaths meaningless. During this period, Mishima produced many essays and speeches on Japan and Japanese culture. In a dialogue about what a Japanese person should die for, he called freedom, democracy, and any political system secondary issues. He argued that the true values to be defended were the three sacred treasures: valor, wisdom, and benevolence, representing both Japanese identity and the emperor. Mishima also criticized capitalist Japan. He argued that the country was abandoning discipline and national identity in favor of comfort and consumerism. Against Western selfish individualism, Mishima praised the samurai spirit of self-sacrifice and the tragic beauty of the kamikaze squadrons. In an interview during this time, he complained that modern life made a heroic death impossible, that he had been born in the wrong age. Mishima was terrified of dying from cancer or another disease, something that would mean a slow physical decline. In one essay, he called it tragic that certain writers continued to cling to their manhood in their later works. He cites Hemingway and Norman Mailer, writing, "I shudder when I think of myself." Mishima was constantly torn between his desire for physical action and literary ambition. He stated that he had once believed art was of supreme importance, but that there was something inside me that couldn't be satisfied with art alone. Like many right-wing critics, Mishima was alarmed by the rise of the radical New Left, which in 1968 and 69 seized control of dozens of Japanese university campuses. Communism was gaining support among students, heavily influenced by China's Cultural Revolution. So in 1968, Mishima founded his own private militia, the Tatsunokai. Its goal was to defend the emperor and restore traditional Japanese values. The group was made up mostly of young, idealistic university students. With only 100 members, it was largely symbolic, more an extension of Mishima's artistic vision than a true military force. In an interview 1 week before his death, Mishima confessed, "I lied when I wrote in my essay that my sister's death was more of a shock than the defeat of Japan. The defeat was a huge shock. I didn't know what to do." On the morning of November 25th, 1970, Mishima and 4 members of the Tatsunokai arrived at a military base in central Tokyo under the pretense of a social visit. Once inside, they took the base commander hostage and barricaded themselves in his office. Mishima then stepped onto the balcony, calling out to the soldiers. He wore a white headband bearing the slogan, "To be reborn 7 times to serve the country." In his speech, Mishima condemned them for accepting a constitution that denies their own existence, urging them to join him in a coup d'etat. "Where has the spirit of the samurai gone?" he shouted. Mishima's other complaints were less specific. Japan had abandoned history and tradition. The nation had sold its soul for money and materialism, leaving only spiritual emptiness. But all of this only irritated the soldiers. They shouted at him as media helicopters roared overhead, drowning out much of his speech. After finishing, Mishima reportedly said, "I don't think they heard me." He returned inside the building and cut open his stomach in the old samurai manner. Masakatsu Morita, allegedly Mishima's male lover, had been chosen as his kaishakunin, the one tasked with beheading him to spare him unnecessary pain. He swung his sword down twice at Mishima's neck, but only managed to cut halfway through. After a third failed attempt, Furukoga, a kendo master, stepped in and decapitated Mishima in a single stroke. Morita then knelt down and stabbed himself in the abdomen. Koga once again completed the ritual. Mishima's death has been interpreted in a few different ways. There is, of course, the idea that by choosing an archaic form of death, he sought to revive Japan's samurai spirit, a call to break free from US influence and return to a traditional Japan. This idea appears throughout his later works. Isao, the beautiful young hero in Runaway Horses, is a right-wing terrorist. He believes he can restore Imperial Japan through violence against corrupt businessmen and politicians. The rebellion fails, and Isao dies by seppuku. The novel ends with the line, "The instant the blade tore open his flesh, the bright disk of the sun soared up and exploded behind his eyelids." There is something contradictory in the cause Mishima adopted. He died as an emperor-worshipping ultra-nationalist, but he lived much of his life in a Western manner. He loved European culture, had many Western friends, and craved fame in the West. Some researchers argue that Mishima's goal wasn't to revive the emperor as a political concept. Instead, he saw him as a cultural unifier, the one symbol capable of standing against both communism and fascism. Maybe Mishima yearned for pre-war Japan because it was the last time people shared a common set of values. An outcast from birth, he desired unity above all else, and this unity was embodied by the emperor. It's also been said that Mishima never escaped his guilt over not becoming a soldier during the war. Hiromichi Nakayasu, a seppuku researcher born the same year as Mishima in 1925, has noted that the Manchurian incident began just as he entered elementary school. For a generation that grew up in an era when war was common, death was inevitable, so the question of how I should die became the main issue. Although Mishima admired the kamikaze, he was too weak, mentally and physically, to join them. This feeling of being excluded from action became a lifelong source of shame. One of Mishima's biographers, John Nathan, suggests the coup attempt was merely an excuse for the ritual death he had long dreamed of. That his death in this excruciatingly painful manner, alongside his male lover, was the climax of an erotic fixation on death. Mishima's choice of death was almost a caricature of Japanese tradition, a kabuki fantasy, another illusion. In his seppuku, he found the perfect synthesis: honor, beauty, and theatrical drama. Despite his claim that the sword was superior to the pen, he died more as an artist than a political activist. Mishima wrote most of his final work, The Decay of the Angel, during a seaside family holiday in August 1970. In a letter to his mentor, he wrote, "To me, finishing this book is nothing more than the end of the world." Mishima's final lines read, "There was no other sound. The garden was empty. He had come, thought Honda, to a place that had no memories. Nothing. The noontide sun of summer flowed over the still garden."